She thought she knew her father, a quiet man who fixed things around the house, paid his bills on time, and never once gave her a reason to question the life they lived. He wore the same old watch for years, drove the same aging car, and spoke very little about the past. To anyone watching, there was nothing remarkable about him, and that was exactly how he wanted it. But the day he died, something shifted in a way Emily Carter could not explain. It wasn't just grief. It was a feeling that something had been left unfinished, something important that no one had warned her about. Because within days of his passing, small details began to surface, details that didn't fit the life she thought she understood. Letters that didn't belong, phone calls that came at odd hours, and a silence from the one person she expected to stand closest to her husband. Because within weeks, everything changed. The man she had spent over a decade building a life with didn't just grow distant. He became unrecognizable. Conversations turned short, then cold, then non-existent. He stopped asking how she was coping, stopped sitting beside her at night, stopped pretending. And then, without warning, he filed for divorce. No long discussions. No emotional confrontation. Just paperwork, clean and immediate, as if he had already made peace with a decision she never saw coming. Emily barely had time to process the loss of her father before she was forced to face the collapse of her marriage. But what broke her wasn't just the divorce. It was what came next, because the woman who stood beside her at the funeral, the one who held her hand while she cried, the one she trusted with every private thought, became the woman who took her place. Not months later, not even after time had softened the damage. Weeks. Her best friend married her ex-husband as if the life Emily had lived was something that could simply be stepped into and continued. No explanation ever felt complete. No apology ever came close to enough. It was as if a plan had unfolded right in front of her, and she had only just realized she was the last to know about it. And in that moment, standing alone with questions no one wanted to answer, Emily began to understand something she had never considered before. Her father hadn't just left her behind. He had left her something else, something hidden beneath years of silence. Because the man she thought lived a small, ordinary life had been hiding a truth so large, so carefully protected, that even the people closest to her were willing to turn against her to reach it. And what they didn't realize, what none of them understood yet, was that Emily was no longer grieving in the same way. The woman they thought they had broken was beginning to see everything clearly for the first time. This story isn't about loss. It isn't even about betrayal. It's about what happens when the truth arrives too late for trust, but just in time for something else. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Emily didn't confront them right away. At first, she did what most people would do. She tried to make sense of it in the quiet, hoping there was some explanation that didn't involve intention. She replayed conversations in her mind, searching for a moment she might have missed, a sign that things were falling apart long before she noticed. But the more she thought about it, the clearer it became. The timing was too precise. Her father dies, and almost immediately, her husband detaches. The divorce is filed before she even finishes settling funeral arrangements. And then the marriage to her best friend happens so quickly it barely leaves room for shock. It didn't feel like a reaction. It felt like a sequence. And that realization changed everything. Because once she allowed herself to consider that possibility, she started asking a different kind of question. Not why did this happen, but when did it begin? The answer didn't come all at once. It came in pieces. A locked drawer in her father's study that she had never seen open before. A set of documents her husband had once casually offered to help organize months before her father passed. A conversation her best friend had insisted on having about estate planning that, at the time, seemed thoughtful, but now felt strangely specific. These weren't coincidences anymore. They were fragments of a larger picture, one that had been forming quietly while she was still living inside it. And then came the moment that shifted suspicion into certainty. It happened when she sat across from the attorney her father had trusted for years, a man she barely knew, but who seemed to know far more about her life than she expected. He didn't begin with sympathy. He began with a question. Has anyone contacted her about the secondary holdings? Emily didn't understand what he meant. Secondary to what? That was when he paused, as if realizing the conversation he was about to have was one she should have already been prepared for. But she hadn't been, not even close, because what he told her next didn't just change her understanding of her father. It changed her understanding of everything. Her father wasn't just financially comfortable. He wasn't quietly successful. He was something else entirely. A man who had built over decades a network of investments, companies, and assets that extended far beyond what anyone could see from the outside. Not in her city, not even just in her country. And all of it, every hidden piece, had been structured in a way that only one person could fully access it after his death. Her. Emily didn't speak for a long time after hearing it. Not because she didn't understand, but because she was trying to reconcile two completely different versions of the same man. The father who fixed broken shelves and reminded her to lock the doors at night. And the man who had quietly controlled a fortune large enough to change the course of multiple lives. It didn't feel real, but the documents were real. The signatures were real. The accounts were real. And suddenly, so was everything else. Because now, the timing made sense. Her husband didn't leave after her father died. He left because her father died. There was a difference. A very important one. What Emily didn't know yet was how much they had already done before she ever sat in that office. Because while she was grieving, while she was trying to hold herself together through loss and confusion, her ex-husband and former best friend had already begun making moves of their own. Requests had been filed. Inquiries had been made. They had attempted to position themselves close enough to the estate to benefit from it, using the years of access they had quietly built while still in her life. And if Emily hadn't walked into that attorney's office when she did, they might have succeeded without her ever realizing how close she came to losing everything. That was the moment something in her shifted. The grief didn't disappear. The betrayal didn't hurt any less, but stopped controlling her, because now she understood what she was dealing with. This wasn't just emotional damage. This was strategy. And for the first time since her father's death, she felt something other than loss. She felt focus. Because if they had been planning something for that long, then they believed she wouldn't see it coming. They believed she would react, not act. And that was where they made their mistake. Emily didn't call them. She didn't send messages or ask for explanations. Instead, she started gathering everything. Every document her father left behind. Every email she could access. Every financial movement tied to accounts she didn't even know existed a week ago. And slowly, a pattern began to form. There were attempts to gain authorization through outdated paperwork, requests that relied on her being unaware of her legal standing, subtle efforts to move assets under the assumption that she wouldn't challenge them. It was careful, quiet, designed to look routine. But once she knew what she was looking at, it became impossible to ignore. The confrontation didn't happen in a dramatic setting. There was no shouting, no public scene. It happened across a table, with legal representatives present, where every word mattered more than emotion. Her ex-husband tried to maintain the same calm demeanor he had used when filing for divorce, as if this was just another negotiation. Her former best friend avoided eye contact at first, then attempted to speak in a tone that suggested misunderstanding rather than intention. But Emily didn't respond the way they expected. She didn't argue. She didn't accuse. She presented facts. Timelines, documents that connected actions to outcomes. And for the first time since everything began, they didn't have control of the narrative. What followed wasn't quick. It stretched over months. Legal reviews, challenges, attempts to dispute certain elements of the estate. But the structure her father had built held strong. Every safeguard he put in place, every decision to keep his life separate from his wealth, now made sense in a way it never had before. He hadn't hidden it because he didn't trust her. He had hidden it because he didn't trust what might happen around her if the truth was known too soon. And he was right. In the end, Emily didn't just protect what was left to her. She secured it in a way that made future interference almost impossible. The people who thought they could step into her life and take control of something they never built found themselves facing consequences they didn't prepare for. Not dramatic ones, not immediate ones, but real ones. Loss of credibility, legal pressure, isolation from the very circles they had tried to enter through her. And slowly, the life they rushed into together began to show the strain of how it started. Emily never returned to the life she had before. Not because she couldn't, but because she understood it differently now. Trust, once broken that way, doesn't rebuild into the same shape. But something else did. Strength that wasn't based on who stood beside her, but on what she could stand through alone. And in the quiet moments, when everything finally settled, she realized something her father may have known all along. That the greatest thing he left her wasn't the wealth, or the structure, or the protection. It was the truth. And the timing of it. Because if she had known earlier, she might have trusted the wrong people even more. And if she had found out later, she might have lost everything before she had the chance to fight for it. Instead, she found out exactly when she needed to. At the moment when everything fell apart, and she had no choice but to see things clearly. Emily thought the hardest part was over once the legal battles began to settle and the structure her father left behind proved stronger than anything her ex-husband and former best friend had tried to do. On paper, it looked like she had won. The assets remained in her control, the attempted access had been blocked, and the people who once stood closest to her were now completely removed from her life. But what she hadn't prepared for was what came after the noise faded. Because when everything finally went quiet, that was when the questions returned. Not about the money, not about the betrayal, but about her father. There were still pieces missing, details that didn't fully connect. And for someone who had spent years living beside him without ever seeing this side of his life, it became impossible to ignore the feeling that she still didn't know the whole story. So she went back, not emotionally this time, but methodically. She returned to his house, to the office she had barely entered while he was alive, and started looking again. Not for financial records, not for assets, but for something else. Something that explained why he had gone to such lengths to separate his life the way he did. That was when she found it. Not hidden in a vault or protected behind anything complex. Just a simple box, placed in a space that felt almost too obvious to notice before. Inside were journals. Not daily entries, not detailed logs of his business dealings, but reflections. Thoughts written over years, sometimes months apart, sometimes closer together. And as she began reading, the man she thought she knew started to come into focus in a way that no document or lawyer could have explained. He wrote about decisions, about risks he took early in life that forced him to become careful, private, controlled. He wrote about trust, about how quickly it can shift once people see what they believe you have. And most of all, he wrote about her, not in a distant way, not as someone observing from afar, but as a father who understood that the life he built could one day affect her in ways he couldn't fully control. There were entries that described moments she remembered, small things she thought were ordinary at the time, now carrying a weight she never noticed before. And then there were entries that spoke directly to what eventually happened. Not in exact detail, but in warning. He wrote about people who enter your life with genuine connection, and how that connection can change when circumstances change. He wrote about how proximity to stability can become proximity to opportunity in the wrong hands. And he wrote about timing. One entry, written not long before his death, stood out more than anything else. It wasn't long, it wasn't dramatic, but it was clear. He acknowledged that there were people around her he didn't fully trust. He didn't name them. He didn't accuse them. But he made it known that he had taken steps to ensure that if anything ever happened to him, she would have the space and the control to see things for herself before anyone else could influence the outcome. He trusted her judgment, but only if she had the chance to use it without interference. And that explained everything. Emily sat with that for a long time, not because it surprised her anymore, but because it confirmed something she had already started to feel. This wasn't something that happened to her without warning. The warning had always been there. It just wasn't visible until everything else was stripped away. And in a way, That realization changed how she saw not just the past, but what came next. She didn't rebuild her life in the way people expected. There was no sudden shift into luxury, no public display of what she now controlled. If anything, she became more private than her father had ever been. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. She knew what attention could bring. She knew how quickly people could change when they believed something could be gained from being close to you. And she wasn't interested in testing that again. But she didn't disappear either. Instead, she made deliberate choices, quiet investments, strategic decisions that reflected not just what her father had built, but what she had learned through everything that followed his death. She surrounded herself with people who had no reason to be there other than the roles they were meant to play. Profesionals, advisors, individuals whose relationship with her was clearly defined, not emotionally blurred. It wasn't cold. It was clear. And that clarity gave her something she hadn't had before: control. As for her ex-husband and former best friend, their story didn't end in a single moment of consequence. It unfolded slowly. The life they stepped into together, built on a foundation that began with timing and advantage, didn't hold the way they expected. Without access to what they thought would come easily, their situation shifted. Opportunities they anticipated didn't materialize. Connections they relied on weakened. And over time, the same dynamic that brought them together began to work against them. Not because of anything Emily did directly, but because of how their decisions shaped what followed. Emily never reached out to them again. Not for closure. Not for answers. Because by the time everything settled, she didn't need either. The truth had already done what it needed to do. It had shown her exactly where things changed, exactly how it happened, and exactly who she was dealing with. And once you see something clearly, there's nothing left to question. Years later, when people would look at her life from the outside, they would see a version of success that seemed carefully managed, almost quiet compared to what it could have been. They wouldn't see the sequence of events that led there. They wouldn't see the loss, the betrayal, the realization that came piece by piece. But Emily saw it. And she understood something most people only realize too late. That what you inherit isn't just what's left behind. It's what you learn when everything you thought was stable proves otherwise. And in the end, the story wasn't about what her father had hidden. It was about why he hid it. It wasn't about what was taken from her. It was about what she refused to lose once she understood the truth. Because the moment everything collapsed wasn't the end of her life as she knew it. It was the moment she finally saw it for what it was. Time passed in a way that no longer felt rushed or uncertain. Emily stopped measuring her life by what had happened and started shaping it by what she chose to do next. The estate her father left behind was no longer something she was trying to understand. It was something she had learned to manage with intention. Every decision she made carried weight, not just financially, but personally. She became more precise, more observant, and far less willing to let anyone enter her life without understanding exactly why they were there. It wasn't about distrust anymore. It was about awareness. There were moments, though, when the past found its way back in, not through people, not through conflict, but through memory. A familiar street, a phrase someone used that sounded too much like something her best friend used to say. A quiet evening that reminded her of conversations she once believed were real. And in those moments, she didn't feel anger the way she once had. What she felt was clarity, because she could now see those memories without the illusion that once surrounded them. She could recognize what was genuine and would have been influenced by something else. And that kind of understanding doesn't erase the past, but changes how it lives with you. One afternoon, nearly 2 years after everything had happened, she received a message she hadn't expected. It wasn't from her ex-husband. It wasn't from her former best friend. It was from someone connected to a part of her father's life she had only recently begun to explore. A business associate who had worked with him years before, someone who had stayed distant but observant. The message was simple. There was something she needed to see, something her father had arranged, but never spoke about directly. At first, she hesitated, not out of fear, but because she had reached a place where she no longer felt the need to keep uncovering things. She had enough. She understood enough. But something about the way the message was written felt deliberate, not urgent, not emotional, just intentional. So she agreed to meet. The meeting didn't take place in a boardroom or an office. It was at a quiet property outside the city, one she had never visited before. And when she arrived, she realized why. It wasn't listed under any of the assets she had reviewed. It wasn't part of the network she had taken control of. It existed separately, intentionally so. The man who met her there didn't waste time with introductions. He simply handed her a set of documents and explained that her father had created something that wasn't meant to be accessed immediately after his death. It was meant to be discovered later, once everything else had settled. Emily read through the documents slowly, not because they were complicated, but because she understood what they represented. This wasn't about money. It wasn't another hidden account or business structure. It was a foundation, one built quietly over time, funded in ways that didn't draw attention, designed to support causes her father had never spoken about publicly. Education programs, community initiatives, long-term investments into people who would never know where the support came from. And at the center of it, there was a single directive. If she found it, it was hers to continue, not as an obligation, but as a choice. For a long time, Emily said nothing. She walked through the property, taking in the details, understanding that this part of her father's life had never been about protection or strategy. It had been about purpose, something separate from the structures he built to guard what he earned. And in that moment, she realized something that hadn't been clear before. Everything he left behind wasn't just about keeping her safe. It was about giving her the ability to decide what mattered once she was. She accepted it, but not in the way someone accepts something unexpected. She accepted it with intention, because for the first time since her father's death, she wasn't reacting to anything. She was choosing, and that made all the difference. As she became more involved in that part of his legacy, her life began to take on a different kind of meaning. Not louder, not more visible, but more grounded. The decisions she made extended beyond her own stability. They reached outward, quietly influencing lives in ways that didn't require recognition. And through that, she found something that had been missing, not during the chaos, but long before it. A sense of direction that wasn't tied to what she had lost, but to what she could build. She never spoke publicly about what happened to her. Not in detail. Not in a way that invited attention or sympathy, because the story people saw from the outside was never the full story. It was just the part that could be understood without context. And Emily knew that some things didn't need to be explained to have meaning. Years later, if someone had asked her whether she would go back and change what happened, her answer wouldn't have been immediate. Not because she questioned it, but because she understood it. The loss, the betrayal, the realization, all of it had led her to a place she wouldn't have reached any other way. And while that didn't make it easy, it made it clear. Because in the end, the most important thing her father left her wasn't hidden in accounts or written into legal structures. It wasn't something anyone could try to take or manipulate. It was something much simpler and much harder to give. The ability to see people as they are, not as they present themselves. The ability to recognize timing, intention, and truth without needing someone else to point it out. And once you have that, once you truly understand it, there's very little that can be taken from you again. And that was the part of the story no one else ever saw. Not the divorce, not the marriage that followed, not even the wealth that changed everything. But the moment a woman who thought she had lost her entire world realized that what remained was more powerful than anything she had before. In the years that followed, Emily stopped looking at her life as something that had been broken and rebuilt. She began to see it as something that had been revealed. The difference mattered more than she expected, because rebuilding suggests loss as the foundation, while revelation suggests truth as the starting point. And once she understood that, everything else became easier to place where it belonged. The betrayal no longer defined her. It became a moment in time, one that exposed what needed to be seen. The wealth no longer felt overwhelming. It became a tool, something she could direct with purpose instead of fear. And her father, the man she once thought she knew completely, became someone she continued to understand in layers, even long after he was gone. There was one final detail she returned to often, something from his journal that stayed with her long after she first read it. It wasn't written as advice. It wasn't framed as a warning. It was just a simple observation he had made about life and people. That the most important decisions aren't the ones you make when everything is stable, but the ones you make when everything changes and you're forced to see clearly. At the time he wrote it, she doubted he could have known exactly how true that would become for her. But standing where she was now, she understood it completely. Her ex-husband and former best friend eventually faded into a distant part of her life, not through dramatic endings or sudden consequences, but through time doing what it always does. It creates distance. The urgency that once defined their actions no longer existed. The advantage they thought they could gain had long since disappeared. And without that, there was nothing left connecting them to the life they had tried to step into. Emily didn't follow what became of them, not because she didn't have the means to know, but because she no longer had the need. What mattered was what she chose to carry forward. The foundation her father left behind became something she expanded in her own way. Not to prove anything to anyone, not to make up for what happened, but because it aligned with who she had become. Quiet impact, thoughtful decisions, a life that didn't require validation to have value. And in that, she found a kind of peace that wasn't dependent on circumstances staying the same, but on her ability to navigate them when they didn't. One evening, years after everything had unfolded, she returned to her father's old house. Not out of obligation, but out of choice. The space hadn't changed much. The same walls, the same quiet atmosphere, the same sense of stillness that once felt ordinary and now felt intentional. She walked through it slowly, not searching for anything, just remembering. And when she reached his office, she paused for a moment before stepping inside. There was nothing left to discover there. No hidden documents, no unanswered questions waiting in drawers. Everything that needed to be found had already been found. But that wasn't why she came back. She sat in the chair he used to sit in, the one place she had rarely seen him relaxed, and allowed herself to feel something she hadn't fully allowed before. Not grief, not anger, not even relief. Just understanding. The kind that doesn't come all at once, but settles over time until it becomes part of how you see the world. She realized then that her story had never been about losing people. It had been about seeing them clearly when it mattered most. It had never been about the fortune she inherited, but about the responsibility that came with it. And it had never been about proving anything to those who hurt her, but about deciding who she would be after everything they did. When she left the house that night, she didn't look back. Not because there was nothing left behind, but because she no longer needed to measure her life against it. She carried what mattered with her. The lessons, the clarity, the strength that came not from avoiding hardship, but from facing it without losing herself in the process. And if there was one question that remained at the end of it all, it wasn't about whether justice had been served or whether things could have turned out differently. It was something quieter, something more personal, a question that didn't need an answer spoken out loud. If everything in your life changed tomorrow, if the people you trusted revealed something you never expected, would you recognize it for what it is, and would you have the strength to become who you need to be because of it?